Well, welcome. I hope you guys enjoyed the keynote, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to this evening. But for now, we're going to talk about reinventing the bulk API. Before I get too far into this, I have some boilerplate that I have to share with you guys. We are a publicly traded company. We're going to be talking about some things that we're thinking about doing, play around with, planning to do. But all your purchasing decisions should only be made on things that are actually commercially available today. So with that caveat, let's jump into it. So my name is Charlie Feynman. I'm the architect on the Enterprise API team. I joined Salesforce a couple of years ago, coming from Google and StubHub and a few other different places. I really liked Salesforce because they're a very product-oriented company. They know how to build products to sell to people and solve real-world problems. So that's why I came from a company that a lot of people ask me why I decided to leave. And the Enterprise API team, I think, offers some interesting challenges on that front. I'm joined by...
I'm Ruben. I'm an engineer on the Enterprise API team. I've been with Salesforce for the last 6 years, on the Enterprise API team for the last 2 years. I started out by building the billing systems, joined Sales Cloud. Now I'm part of the platform where I build the APIs. I do a lot of coding, more for fun than for actual work. When I'm not coding, I do a lot of photography, hikes around the Bay Area.
So let's just jump into the agenda a little bit here. So we're going to start off talking about some of the issues with the current bulk API, and then talk about some of the near-term improvements we're going to be releasing to you guys, along with some of our ideas for V2 version of the bulk API, which is going to solve a lot more of the bigger usability and scalability issues that our current flock of bulk customers are experiencing. And then, of course, we'll have some closing comments and time for Q&A towards the end. So let's just start off with some of the current challenges that we think you guys are facing. So I'm just kind of curious for my own edification, how many of you guys might be experiencing some of these? I'm going to try to sneak in a little seventh inning stretch exercise here, so humor me, both keep your guys' blood running and let me know if you're actually experiencing these things. So how many of you are having to deal with managing the size of batches because of some of the limits that we put in place? What about, how many of you have read the page about maximizing concurrency for large-scale loads? How many of you enjoy the exercise that you go through there? You like the exercise? How about bulk query? How many of you wanted to be able to do joins in bulk query, yet have had to do that kind of stuff server side or client side, I should say, stitching together your own results? I already touched on working around limits, but how many of you are aware of the limits beyond simple batch size that exist within the bulk API and have to wrestle with those? And then finally, right now, our bulk API doesn't really give you the ability to query against your job history. You know, I often joke that people do this by putting a bunch of sticky notes with job IDs on their desktops. So how many of you guys wish that you had an API to query all the jobs that have run in the past N days or are currently running? Okay, all right. So today we're going to be talking about some of the things that we're looking at doing to solve some of these issues.
All right, so what I'm going to be doing is we'll just look at some of these gaps in the bulk API that Charlie mentioned in a little more detail. The first thing, let's talk about bulk query. The thing that stands out is that although bulk query uses SOCL, we don't have the ability to do joins. So if you really had to join data between a master and detailed records, what you'd really do is you would fire a batch that became really loud. You'd fire a batch that would query all the master records, fire on the batch that would query all the child records, and you'd stitch this up by hand, either server side or manually or by a script, which can be error prone. We don't have support for query all. Now, a lot of you or some of you might have programs where you actually have data sync issues or data warehouses where you might want to query all your records, not necessarily the active records, but also records you have deleted or probably archived. That is a problem that we hear quite a bit about. And finally, when you query really, really large batches, like for example, when you use PK chunking, what happens is that that query gets split up into a number of batches, right? And each of those batches have a number of batch results. So to get the result of one particular query and to know your job is complete, what you end up doing is you end up querying all the batches to see if they're complete to start with, and then get and iterate over all the results to actually get all the results. This is, I think, is not an optimal experience for an API, and I think we can do better than that. Second thing that we talk about is limits. Limits are something that everyone on the Salesforce platform deals with. And most of these limits are usually there for a very good reason, usually to protect our service and to protect our customers. But when we looked at the bulk API limits, and we felt some of these were our legacies of our old hardware that we had, or the lack of capacity that we had at some point that we don't have to deal with anymore. So for instance, you talk about like the limits in number of batches per day. It's 5,000 batches a day. Number of records a batch, 10,000 records a batch. Number of fields and characters per record, 800 fields, 400,000 characters. Total size and processing time for batch requests. And this is just for ingest, right? And if someone is writing client code, it's got to take care of all these little things. When we say we're providing a service, I think it should be a lot more smoother. The second bit that I want to talk about is queries count into the same limit as ingest jobs. Now, for us, doing an ingest is a lot more expensive than doing a query, because once you fire an ingest, you're firing off triggers, you're firing off workflows, and a whole lot of other integrations. Now, query is not as expensive for us, so there is no reason for us to actually count it under the same limit. So what are we going to do this release, and what are we trying to do to make life better? To start with, starting in Winter 17, we have increased the limit for all bulk API jobs from 5,000 batches a day to 10,000 batches a day. That is twice the limit. But going forward, that is not it, but going forward, starting spring 17, we have got a number of enhancements planned. To start with, we would like to get SOCL relationship queries in bulk. We would like to get query all support, make that generally available. And finally, we would like to split up the bulk query limit into its own limit versus the ingest. So you could query as long as your limit supports it, and your data loads will not affect what you want to query out, or your query will not affect your data load. But that is just not it. I think we can do a lot better. So Charlie will talk about what we can do better.
Thanks, Ruben. So a lot of the things that Ruben was talking about are very valuable, but I would consider sort of point improvements on the capabilities of bulk API. All right, so I already mentioned job history reports. I won't get much more into that. One thing you'll notice as Ruben gives his demo, that the REST APIs that are in the new version are much more consistent with the rest of our REST APIs. For those of you who hadn't guessed, the bulk API was written before we actually had our more standard REST framework in place. And so you'll notice a lot of syntactic inconsistencies between it, and not as restful of an experience as it might otherwise be. So we're looking at improving that. Basically, we're trying to turn all the problems that you guys have with the usability of the API and make them our problems, so it's just simpler for you guys to use. Probably the most important thing that we keep hearing about is the fact that you guys have to deal with this idiosyncrasy of our implementation, right? We deal in batches. When we consume data into Oracle, it's done in batches, right? We can't take 100 million rows in one fell swoop and put it in, so we have to chunk it up. So what we'd like to do is take on the burden of that batching for you so that you don't have to worry about it. You just send us that 100 million rows and we'll take care of the rest. Queries have a similar problem, as Ruben was mentioning, right? When you use PK chunking. How many of you guys use PK chunking or know what PK chunking is? So for those of you who don't, if you're looking at millions of rows in your entity table, you wouldn't be able to pull all that back efficiently with one query. So what we do is we give you the ability to automatically break it up into ranges of IDs, so you pull back each range independently. But as Ruben was mentioning before, If you do that, then you basically end up having to pull back each individual batch, which is not really natural for you folks. So we're going to try to solve some of those issues. The bottom line is we have more information about how to optimize the ingestion and exporting of data. And so we'd like to take advantage of that improved knowledge, increased knowledge, and take a lot of that burden and guesswork off of your guys' hands. So if you look at the way the bulk API works today, you guys have to cut out the batches yourself, right? A bunch of CSV files, send it over to us manually, give the job controller a kick in the pants, and then constantly harass it, finding out whether it's done or not. Finally, it'll return success, and you can retrieve all of your responses or query results, and on you go. But again, it's a very manual process where you have to take care of a lot of the orchestration yourselves. Instead, what we'd like to do is just have you send us the whole file, right? And then you kick off the job controller, at which point it goes in and carves off a couple of canary batches, say, off of the original large file that you sent us. It'll then have those get processed, and that processor will send information back to the job controller about what resources were consumed in processing those batches. It'll go back to the batch construction and possibly pull back a larger number of batches or larger batches based on what it's discerned from the initial canary batches it sent off, and process those, of course. And when it's done, the job controller then can actively notify you that it's time to move on, whether that be by sending you an email message or possibly even kicking off something like a process that you authored in Process Builder. So Ruben's going to show some of this stuff in an actual demo that he's been working on. While he's setting this up, we've actually been working towards making a lot of this stuff available in the upcoming release as a developer preview. So if you are interested in finding out more about how you might participate in this, our product manager, Jay, is sitting up here in the front row. So please do reach out to him or one of the two of us after the session's over, and we'll see what we can do for you. Okay? So while I continue to stall for Ruben. There we go. Okay.
All right, great. So, all right. Cool. Let me just check my org. My org ready. Logged in. All right, great. So what you see here is a very simple Python application. It's got two panes. And what I'm going to be doing is running through a bulk operation in both V1 and V2 at the same time to show you the difference as to how this thing works. But before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you through every step that it does and then run the demo. So authenticating is pretty straightforward. So when you authenticate, it's a standard. You use a standard SOAP login or use OAuth. It's exactly the same process. And this is where you start seeing the differences between bulk API V1 and bulk API V2. So in V1, to create a job, what you would do is you would post a job representation to services async 38.0/job. But in V2, it's services data V38 bulk jobs. Now, this is because we are building it off the standard REST framework. So what that really means is that you can do things like this. I could go into Workbench, say services data, bulk jobs, and execute, and it logs me out. Right. Here you go. So let's see this. 38 bulk jobs, and I get a list of jobs that have been run in my org. Now I can actually query these, can continue pasting the IDs on there. It's a standard REST URL that you can go on building up. So it's job/job ID, get more details about the job. You can also filter on jobs. We are given like very basic options right now. So you can filter jobs by state, by the content type, but we are open to feedback, and we'll add more as we get more feedback. The second part is where we create batches, and this is where you see a big difference in bulk API V1 and bulk API V2. So in V1, what you're really going to be doing is, if there's a client, it's going to take every line in the file, validate if it meets the criteria for the number of fields, the size of the line, and the second level of validation it does is, have I exceeded the limit of the file size in terms of the size of the file or the number of records? And finally, you post to services async 38.0 job batch. But in V2, you don't have to do any of that. What you do is you just simply post to services data, V38, bulk job ID, and batches, and you get a batch. So as of now, we've got a limit of 100 MB on the file, so you could just post like a 100 MB CSV file at this, and it should work. And finally, we close the job. Closing a job is really just posting a job representation to the URL. So let's run this demo and hope that the demo gods are kind on me. All right. There you go. And you can see this is bulk API V1 still working, bulk API V2 is done. And so if you notice, bulk API V1 has created a number of batches. In this case, I was loading up 100,000 records into accounts. And I created 10 batches out of that, and I uploaded that. But whereas in bulk API V2, it's just one batch, and it took a total of 4 seconds versus 7 seconds. And in some cases, the larger data load, the more this will show. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to log in to my Salesforce org where I've loaded this data, and I'll show you what's happened with the V2 job, because I'm guessing you're familiar with what the V1 job looks like. So let me look at the job ID. That is IAA. So jobs, bulk data load jobs. Which one is that? CTK. So this is the bulk V2 job. Now what you'll see here is you have one batch that has got 0 records processed. I can increase the font size. Okay, this is your original batch that you posted, and right now it says 0 records processed because we don't really do any processing on this batch. But what we do instead is that we take this batch and we split it up into a number of child batches, and we start processing that. So this is what bulk API V2 demo does right now. In addition to that, we are not counting the number of batches. The limits are based on number of records. So batches as a concept doesn't exist in bulk API V2. So hopefully trying to make it, the intent being that we want to make limits more transparent and the usage of the API more transparent to you. So I guess that's my demo. Yeah, let me start with this. All right, play. Oh, you got that? Okay.
Okay. Hello. There we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, if you're interested in this, reach out to us after the session, and we'll get you set up, hopefully, with a developer preview in a sandbox. You can play around with it and give us some feedback. This is going to be a limited developer preview because Jay has to manage a lot of this by hand, so let's be kind to Jay, like we always are. What we're looking at in the upcoming releases is, well, like I said, developer preview of this stuff that does server-side chunking, metering by records instead of batches. And although the 100 megabyte is not a larger limit than what you can actually ingest into the system today, as Ruben showed, you can ingest it in one fell swoop instead of having to carve this up into your own batches. So that hopefully will be pretty valuable to you guys. Beyond, of course, we're not looking to just end a developer preview. We want to get this out into GA eventually. Next step is pilot, and hopefully the next follow-on release. We're going to add support for the bulk queries, so you can do joins, hopefully. Adding support for record grouping to deal with some of the concurrency things that I alluded to before. And then adding full support for the job management, and retrieving things as a single result set as opposed to having to stitch together a bunch of sub-batches like you have to do today, and the notification. So ultimately, what we're after here is to make bulk API a much more easy to use, friendly integration tool where you guys don't have to deal with a lot of the headaches that you have to deal with in terms of integration. So in the simplest case, let's say you have your own orchestrator on your side that is exporting data. So you would generate the file, send it against our endpoint, and just wait for some callback to happen that indicates that the job is completed, right? We're even going to start looking at things. So that's a push model. I'd actually be kind of curious, how many of you would be interested in a pull model where instead of sending us the file, you send us a URL and we retrieve it incrementally? Okay, that's good to know. Because one of the things we're after is building a much more reactive system that will keep the hoppers as full as we can keep them. One of the reasons why we chose a 100 megabyte limit was because we wanted to also, we didn't have the mechanisms in place to deal with resumption and things like that. So obviously with a pool model, you would be dealing with data streaming resumption and things like that. So that's going to enable us to support much, much larger sizes. I won't get into the actual number of zeros, but we're definitely looking at going well north of that 100 megabyte limit. So I think the other thing that's particularly interesting about what we're working on, and I haven't gone into a lot of details yet because we're still playing around with this, but as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of information about what's going on in the system, right? There are things that you know about within the data model that you can organize your batches around. For example, the master record and lookup locking that happens. But there are a lot of things that you might not be aware of, perhaps because you installed a package that has a bunch of triggers in it, that has a bunch of hidden locks that are happening over the course of a transaction that you just don't have that visibility into. We do. So we could actually do those canary batches and reorganize the data on the fly to make sure that we maximize efficiency. Similarly, we can keep an eye on how many Apex resources are being consumed as it flows through the system so that we can shape batches accordingly. So we could send those canaries in and extrapolate out based on the actual on-the-ground performance that we've seen. So that is the end of our presentation. And if you guys have any questions now or after, we are here for you. Thank you.